Critical thinking, it's not just about being smart, it's about survival in a world where 93% of people admit to sharing news without verifying if it's true. Today, we're exploring why our brains actively fight against finding the truth and what we can do about it.
That's such a striking statistic. You know, it reminds me of when I discovered that famous fact about Napoleon being short was completely wrong. He was actually average height for his time. Made me wonder how many other things I believe without questioning.
Well, here's what's fascinating about that example. Our brains aren't actually wired for truth, they're wired for survival. Neuroscience shows that when we encounter information challenging our core beliefs, our brain triggers the same response as a physical threat.
So you're saying our ancient survival instincts are actually working against us in the modern information age?
Exactly right. And here's where it gets really interesting. Studies show that even when presented with clear evidence that contradicts their beliefs, roughly 76% of people will double down on their original position rather than change their minds.
That explains why social media arguments rarely change anyone's mind. But what about quantum mechanics? I've heard it suggests reality itself isn't fixed.
Oh man, this is where things get wild. According to quantum theory, the act of observation literally affects the behavior of particles. It's like reality itself is shaped by how we perceive it. Think about that. Two people can witness the exact same event and experience it completely differently.
Well, that certainly puts a new spin on the idea of objective truth. How do we even begin to think critically when reality itself seems so fluid?
You know, this is where we need to talk about information processing. Studies show that the average person makes about 35,000 decisions every day, but our conscious mind only processes about 40 of those decisions. The rest, pure autopilot.
That's exactly why we need better mental tools. Like, how do we even start breaking free from these mental shortcuts?
Well, let me share something fascinating from recent cognitive research. When people are trained in basic critical thinking skills, their ability to detect misinformation improves by roughly 50% within just a few weeks. The key is learning to detach emotions from analysis.
Oh, speaking of emotions, I've noticed how news headlines are specifically designed to trigger emotional responses. They're basically hacking our brain's survival instincts.
Right. And here's the really insidious part. Studies show that emotionally charged headlines get shared up to 70% more often than neutral ones, regardless of accuracy. We're literally being programmed to spread misinformation because it feels more engaging.
That's honestly pretty terrifying when you think about the implications for society. How do we protect ourselves against this kind of manipulation?
So, this is where we need to talk about developing what researchers call cognitive immunity. It's like building mental antibodies against manipulation. The first step is learning to recognize your own emotional triggers and biases.
Like how confirmation bias makes us seek out information that supports what we already believe.
Exactly. And research shows we're about twice as likely to accept information that confirms our existing beliefs without fact checking it. But here's the good news: awareness of this bias alone reduces its effect by about 29%.
That's actually more encouraging than I expected. What other practical tools can people use?
Well, one powerful technique is what cognitive scientists call the Steelman approach. Instead of looking for flaws in opposing viewpoints, try to build the strongest possible version of arguments you disagree with. Studies show this improves critical thinking scores by up to 43%.
You know what's interesting about that? It reminds me of how scientific breakthroughs often come from challenging consensus thinking.
Oh man, let me tell you about a fascinating study on scientific consensus. Researchers found that roughly 34% of scientific papers that were initially rejected as impossible or contrary to established knowledge went on to earn their authors Nobel Prizes.
That really shows how dangerous it can be to just accept what everyone else believes.
And here's where quantum mechanics comes back into play. Just like particles exist in multiple states, until observed, ideas often contain multiple possibilities until we examine them critically. The act of questioning literally changes what we're capable of seeing.
So what you're saying is that critical thinking isn't just about being right or wrong. It's about expanding our ability to perceive reality itself.
Precisely. And recent studies in neuroplasticity show that practicing critical thinking actually creates new neural pathways. Your brain physically rewires itself to become better at processing complex information.
Well, that explains why it feels so uncomfortable at first. We're literally building new mental muscles.
You know what's fascinating? Research shows it takes about 66 days of consistent practice to form a new mental habit. That's the timeline for rewiring these neural pathways we're talking about.
I imagine most people give up before reaching that point.
Well, the data backs that up. Studies show roughly 80% of people abandon new thinking patterns within 2 weeks. But those who push through that initial discomfort report a 47% increase in their ability to detect logical fallacies.
That's really powerful. Any final thoughts on where people should start?
Here's what cognitive research suggests. Start small. Question one assumption per day. Write it down. Look for evidence both for and against it. Studies show this simple practice improves critical thinking skills by about 31% over 3 months.
That actually sounds doable. Much better than trying to question everything at once.
Exactly. Remember, critical thinking isn't about destroying beliefs, it's about building better ones. And the research shows that people who develop this skill report feeling more confident, less anxious, and better equipped to handle complex decisions.
Well, this has been incredibly enlightening. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into critical thinking.
Indeed. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and remember, the truth is rarely comfortable, but it's always worth pursuing.